You can't just be a normal user and go making system-wide modifications. So there's a few different ways that you can become administrator or assume administrative permissions, really root permissions they're called, and that is what we are going to talk about in this video. So the title of this video is Understanding the Power of Sudo, and there's a related command called su, and people pronounce it different ways. I say su and sudo. A lot of people say sudo, but it's just a matter of preference. And we're going to discuss the differences between those and why sudo or sudo is typically considered superior. So let's dive into it here. Obviously, we need the right permissions to make system-wide modifications, and we can do that in a few ways. Su, S-U, or sudo, and again, we'll discuss the difference there. We'll talk a little bit about VSudo, which can be used to change pseudo configurations. So you can, for instance, allow certain users access to certain commands, but not other commands. So you can get more granular than the default configuration, which is if a user is given sudo access, then they can run any command. So they're essentially, they can execute commands as if they were root, and it doesn't matter what command they're trying to execute. And we'll also talk about the sudoers file. That's where you typically are going to modify pseudo configurations if necessary using VSudo. All right, so let's talk about a few different ways that we can become administrator. The first one is su, S-U. It stands for switch user, and this is just going to drop you in as root, which means until you type exit and exit that root shell, you're just going to be root. So ideally, you want to avoid using SU, and the reason is it can make it more, I guess, possible for you to make mistakes, because now you're root. Linux doesn't have a lot of guardrails. It's not going to prevent you from running commands, especially if you're root. So that's one reason that you don't want to just stay as root indefinitely. Another reason is that if like say you run a malicious package or something, someone could take over your system a lot more easily if you're commonly logged in just sort of perpetually as the root user. So SU, it does allow you by default to switch to the root user depending on distribution, or you can also use it to switch to other users. So if you have some other user account that you want to log into temporarily, you can pass that as an argument. So you could like specify a certain username and switch to that user as well. But the default behavior is it makes you the root user. And you can run SU by itself and just type SU and press enter, and that will drop you into a root shell. But there's a few weird things that happen. So for instance, environmental variables don't all get changed. So you, for instance, probably the most obvious difference, or I guess obvious strange behavior, is that if you run SU by itself, you're going to stay in the current directory that you're in. So say you're logged in as Shane in Shane's home directory, and you type SU, press enter, log in as root, then you're still going to be in Shane's home directory. So a lot of times you'll want to actually just add a dash here. So SU space dash is going to change a few more environmental variables. It's going to bring you to the root user's home directory instead of whatever user you were previously logged into. But again, we don't typically want to use SU if we can avoid it. We want to use sudo or sudo. And this allows you to run individual commands as root. So you can say like sudo apt install some package, and it's just that command that is run, and you kind of return to the previous user's shell immediately after that. So it's more secure for that reason, because you're not just continuously logged into the root account, but it's also more secure because sudo commands are logged and they can be audited. Whereas if you use SU and you just become root perpetually, then none of the things that root does are logged by default. So there's better auditing capabilities with sudo. You're kind of limiting how much you're using super user or root permissions. So that is the way that you typically want to invoke administrative commands when you don't have permissions as a normal user. So we're going to demonstrate this, don't worry. But the first thing that we should talk about is, okay, so we definitely want to use sudo if at all possible. But how do we allow a given user to use sudo? And it's pretty straightforward actually, but it does depend on the distribution. So if we're talking about Debian distributions, then we would add them to the Pseudo group. And we'll see the command for that, and we're going to talk more about groups down the line, so we'll review it as well. But essentially, any user that we want to be able to invoke sudo and kind of assume root privileges, we have to add them to a Pseudo group. There's just a group called Sudo in Debian, Ubuntu, that whole family of Linuxes. And it's very similar with sort of Red Hat variants of Linux. It's just that the group has a different name. So for Red Hat variants of Linux, you have to add that user to the wheel group. And that will allow them to, by default, run any command using the sudo command and basically assume temporarily root permissions. So we can kind of see here in the output, we've got a user, this is Joshua on an Ubuntu system. He's trying to just print out the contents of the sudoers file, which is kind of restricted for obvious reasons. So there is a permission denied. He tries to run it as sudo, which if he was a sudo user, he'd be able to actually view the contents. And he enters the right password, but because he's not in the sudo group, as defined in the sudoers file, it's going to print out kind of a scary warning, right? You're not in the sudoers file, you're not in the right group, and this is going to be reported. So that's going to be logged in the sudo log on Ubuntu. So if you actually add the user to the sudo group, let's see, we've got, so we're just basically printing out this etc group file that contains group to user mappings, and we are searching. So we're actually taking the output of that. We're not just printing out the whole file, we're piping it in. So we're taking the output of that and piping it into another command called grep, and we're searching for a string of text, which is sudo. So essentially this is saying, hey, I want to see the etc group file, but first just show me lines that contain the 4 characters sudo in that order. That's essentially what we're doing. And so the output here, we can see, is sudo. It's got an X, it's group ID 27, but there's no members. That would be the last field there at the end, which is empty. So if we use the usermod command here, usermod-ag, and I'm not sure if this syntax actually works. So the way I typically do it is usermod-ag dash lowercase a uppercase g sudo followed by the username, which in this case would be Joshua. Maybe that syntax works, but I haven't used it. I haven't used that syntax before. Joshua. So, and that's going to add Joshua to the sudo group. And if we run that same command, we print out the etc groups file, etc group file singular, and we search for sudo. Now Joshua is actually a member of that group, and that user can now use the sudo command to do administrative stuff. And it works the same way in Red Hat. It's just the group's called wheel. So if you want to modify the VSudo, the sudoers file, you need to use a command called VSudo. In a lot of situations, you'll just use the default behavior, which is anyone that is in the sudo or wheel group can run any commands, but you might need more granularity depending on the number of users, if you've got any junior administrators or anything like that. So this is where you would go and say, hey, I want to make this group, maybe you call it junior admins, and I want to allow them to run X, Y, and Z administrative commands, but nothing else by default. So let's take a look at that. You'd use the vsudo command, and you really need to. You really, really want to, because that's going to do things like syntax checking and ensure that you don't break the sudoers file and kind of lock out users and mess up your system. So definitely use vsudo anytime you want to make modifications to the sudoers file. And the syntax is pretty straightforward. So we see, here's our group. This is the sudo group. So we know we're on some sort of Debian variant of Linux because it would be the wheel group over in Red Hat. And we can see, it's all color-coded here, so all hosts or servers, all users, all groups can execute all commands. It might be kind of hard to see, but that last all is purple. That corresponds to commands. And you can specify individual commands, individual users, and specific groups and so forth, and add additional lines. The default behavior is for the sudo group, well, they can just do anything now if we place them in that group. And we'll take a quick look at it, but modifying the sudoers file isn't a super common task, at least not in my experience, but it's a relatively straightforward syntax, and if you want to play around with that, well, I encourage you to. So a big problem with the sudo command is that a lot of times we just forget to use it. So there's a trick that I just want to show you. So let me just kind of give you a scenario here. Say we are in the sudo group or the wheel group, and we have the ability to use the sudo command, but we just forget to use it. So maybe we run, for instance, apt install CowSay. Well, if we run it without using sudo, then it's just going to kick us back, right? It's going to say, you can't do that. You're not a root user. So a quicker way of rerunning the command as sudo, and this is sort of just a bash shortcut to save you some time, is sudo Bingbang it's called, or sudo exclamation point. And this is going to rerun whatever the previous command was with sudo. So I'm really guilty of this all the time. I always forget to use sudo. And so this is like one of the commands. Probably if you did statistics on my command line interface interactions, this is like 10% of the commands I run. Pseudobingbang, that will just allow you to run that previous command, but actually assume kind of root privileges in order to accomplish it, right? And not get kicked back. All right, so just in summary, we talked about SU and why you don't typically want to use it. We talked about sudo and the benefits of using it. You're logged in with those permissions quite a bit less. You don't assume those root permissions as much. And it's also logged. So we can always go back and see what people were doing with sudo if they're actually using sudo and not SU. VSudo is the command that you would use. It's basically like V, right? But it's for modifying the sudoers file. And it does syntax checking. So you don't ever want to use like another text editor like straight V or Nano or something to modify the etc sudoers file. Because if you mess up the syntax, then you could be kind of up a creek. And it can be kind of a bear to recover from that. And we talked about the sudoers file. This is where we can configure, hey, I want this group, associated with this host or set of servers, this user, this group, again, to run these commands. So that's like the general syntax for the sudoers file. So now let's take a look at both Red Hat and Ubuntu at the command line interface. And I've got some commands that I've sketched out. So we'll see how this demo goes. But I want to at least cover all the highlights. So the first thing we'll do, we're in currently a Red Hat variation of Linux. So this is Rocky Linux. If I just type SU here and I enter the root password, I want to show you, notice that where we're at currently. So we are in Shane's home directory. We're the root user, and we know that because we got the #. I could even type pwd for you. And we're in home Shane as the root user. And the difference is if I exit out of this kind of subshell that we invoked by running SU, if I run SU dash and enter the root user's password, then we are now in the root, we're still in the root account. We can see that from the #, but we are in the root home directory, which is if I do a pwd /root. So that's one of the main differences between running SU and just SU dash is that you're going to start in the root user's home directory if you use the dash. And a lot of times that's preferable. All right, so let's go back out to my previous session as Shane. And let me just demonstrate. Let's say DNF install Nano. So Nano is not installed by default on Rocky Linux. So we say we want to actually install it. Well, because I'm not using the sudo command here, it's going to kick us back. And I'm just going to press enter and error. This command has to be run with superuser privileges. So yeah, we have to either be logged in as root using SU, or we have to use the sudo command. And we can check if we are a sudo user in a few different ways, actually. So we could, for instance, say cat, let's see, etc group, but this prints out a lot of information, right? That's like a little bit much. So if I clear the screen again, I'm gonna press the up arrow to reuse that command. If we take that output and pipe it, so take the output and use it as the input to another command called grep, we can search specifically for the pseudo group on Red Hat systems, which is called wheel. And notice that here's the wheel group. And the user Shane is part of the wheel group. So we know that the Shane user can use sudo. And there's a few other ways you could do it. So you could run ID. You could specify a specific username with it, or if you just run it by itself, it's just going to tell you information about the current account that you're logged in as. So with ID, we see, all right, I'm Shane. My group is Shane here. So that's sort of the default behavior. And I'm also a member of wheel. And you could also run groups. And we see that the user is a member, the Shane user is a member of the Shane group, as well as the wheel group. So there's different ways you can check. Does this user, are they a member of the group that grants them sudo powers? So ID, groups, or you could just cat out etc group. And there's other ways to do it too, but those are kind of 3 common ways. All right, so what if we wanted to actually install Nano? Then we just run sudo. Sudo DNF, this is just the package manager on kind of newer Red Hat based systems. We want to install Nano. Actually, one second, let me control C. Let's say DNF install Nano. And it's going to say no. And let me just show you a quicker way of doing it, Sudobingbang. And so we enter our password. And it's going to say, are you sure you want to install Nano? Yes, please. Let's do it. And there we go. So Nano is installed. If I clear the screen, if I run Nano, now we've got Nano installed. That's kind of how you do it on a Red Hat system. So I'm going to do Control X and exit out of that. And that kind of shows us how you would work with pseudo users on a Red Hat system. So you just add them or make sure that they're in the wheel group. And now let's take a look over on the Ubuntu system. And in this case, we've got a non-sudo user, and I'll show you how to add them to the appropriate group so that they can do administrative stuff. In this one, I've already added the Shane user to that group. So let's jump over to Ubuntu. And here in Ubuntu, let me kind of arrange the screen so it's just right. I'm going to say, as the Shane user, let's just say apt install CowSay. CowSay is an awesome program. You'll see what it does momentarily. It's very useful. So apt install CowSay, again, we get this permission denied message. Kind of like a slightly different output than over on Red Hat systems, but you get the idea. We don't have permissions to do that. And so we could do the same thing. You know, we could say cat etc group. And we could also grep for not wheel this time because it's a different group name on Debian systems. We could grep for sudo. And notice, all right, I am a sudo user. That's great. So I'm a member of that. And we could also do ID in groups too. And they all tell us, all right, yeah, the user Shane is a member of the sudo group. And the user Shane here, or this is actually just the Shane group. But because I ran it as the Shane user, we're a member of the Shane group is what I'm getting at. And we're also a member of the sudo group. So that's how you can kind of check, which means that I could run sudo apt install CowSay and it should install the application. So let's do that. Install CowSay. And if I press enter and enter my password for this user account, this will install CowSay. And let's clear the screen. Let me show you what CowSay does and then we'll uninstall it. All right, so CowSay, it's kind of fun, I guess, in just certain scenarios, but it's actually pretty useless. So CowSay will just take any text that you provide it and it makes a CowSay it. So you could say, you know, moo, comma, I like Linux. Let me put that in quotes too, just to be safe. I don't remember if that comma is going to mess up, you know, the bash syntax. So CowSay moo, I like Linux. And there you go. Now a cow has said moo, comma, I like Linux. So that's all CowSay does. So let's go ahead and remove that, and then we'll kind of demonstrate this with a non-sudo user, and then put them in the sudo group and see if it works. So we're going to say sudo apt remove CowSay. Don't worry, we'll get to these package managers later. They have very similar syntaxes across different package managers, but just different commands. And now we do not have the CowSay command. So say we want to switch to another user, which is Hulk. And let me just do a tail -n. We'll say the last line of the etc password file, which contains all the users. I just made the Hulk user. So he's at the very end here, and he is not a member of the pseudo group as of yet. So if we switch users to his account, we could say su-hulk and enter the right password here. Now we're the Hulk user, and we're in the Hulk home directory, so everything checks out. So let's try to run sudo apt install CowSay again. And we'll enter Hulk's password. And he's not in the sudoers file, so this incident will be reported, it says. So what does that mean? Well, we'll actually look at that momentarily. So I'm actually going to exit out of this Hulk session because I need to go back to the Shane user that can actually use sudo. And I want to show you a few things. First off, sudo. Let's say sudo, I don't know, tail-n20 varlog. And you can always press tab twice if you want to see what the contents of a directory are. And we want to, I believe it's auth.log if I remember. Let's see if that's the right one for Ubuntu. I'm a little bit, I use Ubuntu a little bit less than Red Hat variant of Linux. Variants of Linux. All right, so yeah, that looks like it was right. So what do we have here? So we've got this command. This is where the sudo commands are logged, successful or otherwise. So notice how we got the Hulk user is not in the sudoers file, so this got kicked back. So this is not good, but it was logged, and that's one of the benefits of using sudo. And this other one, that we just ran, the Shane user was in the pseudo group, I should say, and for that reason it was still logged, but it was actually allowed because we can actually see the output of this command now. So that's kind of one benefit of using sudo as opposed to su, because su is not, anything you do after using su is not going to be logged. All right, so how do we actually add Hulk to the pseudo group on Ubuntu? Let's do that. Once again, we need to use sudo. This is sort of an administrative command. We're making a change to another user account, usermod -ag. So we're going to add a group to a given user. The group we're going to add is called sudo, and the user we want to add to is Hulk. All right, so let's double check that that worked. We can use the command id Hulk, and Hulk is a member of sudo. We can use the command groups Hulk, and Hulk is a member of sudo. And we could also do the other thing, which is cat etc groups, and we could grep for sudo. etc group, got to get it just right. etc group, and we grep for sudo. And notice now that the pseudo group has two users, Shane and Hulk. So what we can now do is jump back in as Hulk and see if we can install CowSay. So let's do that. We'll say su, we'll use that dash, Hulk 314, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. So yeah, I'm not very creative with passwords and usernames, in case you didn't pick up on that. All right, so now we're logged in as Hulk. Can Hulk actually install the coveted CowSay? Sudo apt install CowSay. We'll enter Hulk's password, and he can. We could say, I don't know, let me press enter a bit, CowSay meow. And yeah, that's probably something that Hulk would say, being a cat. All right, so let's exit out to the previous account, the Shane account. I'm gonna clear the screen. And one other thing to just show you really quickly is that VSudo file. So if you ever want to modify it on, well, really, if you ever just want to modify it on Linux, I was gonna say on Linux, but that's kind of implied, isn't it? So you could say sudo VSudo. Obviously, you're going to need kind of root permissions to modify the sudoers file. Press enter, and now we're in the sudoers file. So it does a few things. It does some syntax checking. It also modifies a temporary file instead of the existing file directly, which is preferable because like partial modifications, for instance, could break things. And one thing I want to show you, it looks like Nano is unfortunately Nano is the default over here on Ubuntu. So let me see if I can do Control caret and see if I can search on Nano. No, that just does that. Let me see, Control Shift. No, it's Control // that's what it is. Okay, so that allows you to go to a specific line, but this is one of the reasons that I actually like V as opposed to Nano. So it looks like, yeah, over here on this Ubuntu system, we're using Nano. And we can like search for text, for instance, I believe with Nano, although I've never done it before. So it says like Control T is going to go to text here. So we could search, and we could search in this case for, I don't know, sudo, $sudo, and that will kind of go through and search for instances of that string of text in this text editor. So let me try that one more time and see if it actually accepts regular expressions. I'm kind of learning along with you here. So if we do a caret symbol means does the line start with what comes immediately after it. So we do caret $sudo. No, it doesn't seem like it works. So let me show you how this works in VSudo, using V, that is. I'm going to Control X out of that, and we'll look over on the Rocky Linux server. Maybe I should get my Nano chops up a little bit more, but I'm a little bit more familiar with V. So if we do VSudo over here on the Rocky Linux, the Red Hat variant of Linux, sudo VSudo, again, we have to enter our password. The default text editor here is actually just V or Vim. So the way that you can search for a specific line that you want to modify, at least in Vim, is you could do, let's say, // So this is like searching forward through the document. You could use a caret that says, I want lines that begin with something. So the caret kind of represents the very beginning of a line. And we could say % wheel. So we want lines that begin with a % followed by the word wheel. Press enter, and it brings us immediately to this line. This is sort of the default configuration. The wheel group can do everything, all users, but we could, if we wanted to, say they can only run a certain set of commands, or we could even do things like, add another group. If I press I, and maybe we have like junior admins. You know, we could define more granular pseudo permissions for other groups or for the wheel group. So it's kind of unfortunate. I'm not super familiar with searching using Nano, but it's relatively straightforward in Sudo. So let me just kind of reiterate that. I'm going to first off get rid of that line that I entered using DD. And then if I go to press escape, again, you can search forward using this /. We'll talk a little bit more about regular expressions, but if you want to search for a line that begins with something, you can begin it with a caret. You want to search for a line that ends with something, you can end it with a $, and it will just search forward. Or alternatively, you can also search backwards using a question mark. So maybe we want to search backwards for, oh geez, just the word group. So it searches kind of back up. All right, so yeah, that's kind of a little bit of extra functionality. It's kind of just baked into Vim and V. And apparently it is baked into Nano, but I'm not sure like how the regular expressions work. So that demonstration kind of fell flat. But I believe that's everything I wanted to talk about in this video. So, you know, thank you as always for sticking with me. And hopefully that was helpful. It kind of explains some things. And now that we know how to kind of invoke administrative permissions, become the root user and so forth, we'll talk a little bit more about doing administrative stuff. So that's like working with users, working with groups, security concepts, installing software and all of that. But that's a pretty good summary of how the different ways and the pros and cons of those ways of becoming the root user. All right, thanks. I'll see you in the next video.